We Are Stockholm is a music festival for teenagers in the town centre, devised 16 years ago to keep kids out of trouble. But for the last 2 summers, some of the people it was designed to help have used it as an opportunity for something more sinister. It looks a little different in the snow, but this is where the festival happened and where teenage girls say they were groped, harassed and even raped by young men, allegedly in the main young Afghan asylum seekers. But it's taken 5 months and the events in Germany for the story to emerge, because although the police were aware of the crimes, they didn't make them public. And that's left this country that's always prided itself on its welcoming, open attitudes to refugees, grappling with some awkward questions. It was a cover-up, wasn't it?
No, we didn't cover up, of course we didn't. But we didn't tell. And there are so many things we don't tell, because we have so much information, so much things going on. We have hundreds of cases every 24 hours, and in this case we didn't tell. And that was a mistake, a big mistake today. But of course it wasn't a cover-up.
So if teenage girls had reported sexual assaults by white Swedes at this event, would you have taken the same decision?
Yeah, absolutely. And the thing is that we never, in the police, we never talk about if they're Swedes or if they come from any other parts. The media does, but we don't. At the 170,000 strong festival in 2014, 17 teenagers said they'd been sexually attacked and 1 complained of rape. A year later there were 19 assaults and 1 rape. 1 person is being prosecuted.
These guys, they were like 5, 10, 15 sometimes. The only goal for them to go into this crowd is to sexually harass these young girls.
Roger Tikwalu set up the festival and still runs it for Stockholm City Council.
And in the beginning it looks like they're having just fun and, you know, dancing in this huge crowd of people. And then what happens that they surround them and start to gather around them, and then suddenly they start to sexually harass them, you know, touching breasts, crouch and stuff like that.
For some, Swedish culture is under threat. For others, the ethnic background of the assailants is irrelevant. What's clear is that Swedes don't know which way to turn, having taken in more refugees per head of population than any other European country. The man in charge of policing the festival said this week they'd worried about talking about the assailants' backgrounds for fear of playing into the hands of the Swedish Democrats. They're the anti-immigration party riding high in the polls right now.
It's just wrong. They shouldn't in any way let political views affect their work, what they report or not. Young men in group treating this as some kind of fun way to spend an evening or to go to a party and just pick out women and harass them in group, rape them in group. That's definitely nothing that has been existing here before.
So you do blame migrants more generally?
For these kind of assaults, I blame the culture they come from, and I blame the fact that they don't want to accept that in Sweden we have a completely different view of women.
Sweden's policy towards migrants has seen an about turn. This refugee centre used to offer advice to up to 1,000 refugees a day. Since the government closed the border this month, it's down to 20. Right-wing groups blame cultural differences for the New Year attacks in Cologne and the assaults at Stockholm's festivals. But here they reject that kind of stereotyping.
I might be naive, I don't know, but I still don't see it as anything to have to do with cultural differences or religions and so forth. It's individual acting upon themselves and misbehaving.
And what should Sweden do about it?
Take them to justice, just as anyone else.
Tonight in Sweden, it's the police who are under flak. And in this unashamedly liberal nation, there's been some soul-searching about their approach. So if it isn't a cover-up, what might explain this not emerging for so long?
Well, I think we all carry a bit of self-censorship, that we are afraid of discussing this question because you can appear like a racist. And this is a cultural thing for us. We don't go there. We don't go in that, what we say, dark places. And that's maybe a problem for Swedes.
Katie Razzle there in Stockholm. Now, it's not surprising that people have looked at what's happened there and in Cologne, or potentially here in Rotherham, and spotted a pattern of PC policing. It's not surprising that fueled resentment and cynicism with those in power. So let's give some thought to the problem this issue raises for those who've been making the case for the Swedish or German welcoming approach. I'm joined by the writer Nesreen Malik, journalist and blogger Sunny Hundal, and the Spectator editor Fraser Nelson. Evening to you all. I mean, in some ways, this has been portrayed and can be portrayed kind of as a crisis of liberal conscience, wanting to help migrants, upholding women's rights, and the result of the sort of dissonance that results from it is a kind of paralysis of unwillingness to say anything. Nazarene, is that right?
Not necessarily. I don't think these things are necessarily mutually exclusive. I think one can be concerned about and support women's rights and also be concerned about asylum seekers and refugees and understand that they're not irreconcilable. If you have a huge influx of people from a different culture, it's very unlikely that it's going to be an easy integration process. Having said that, that's not a reason to throw the baby out with the bathwater. So I think the question itself is not necessarily an accurate one.
Can I just ask, Nazarene, do you agree with the comment made by one of the refugee community workers there, we saw her in the piece, who said she didn't really believe there were cultural differences. This is just individual differences. There are good apples and bad apples in every bucket. And I just wonder whether you think there are these differences or not.
Both those things are correct. There are bad apples and good apples everywhere in the world, but there are cultural differences. And it's not I don't think it's a particularly controversial thing to say that if you let people in from a culture which is more conservative and more patriarchal into a very liberal society, there's going to be bumpy steps across, along the road. And that's not something people should shy away from recognizing.
Sanni Handal, do you think this is a kind of crisis for progressive thinking, like yours, actually?
It's a crisis if we think that refugees are not going to make mistakes, if they're angels, and they're not. It's frustrating for people like myself who've obviously been making the case for Europe to accept more refugees, and then you see an incident like this, and you think, how is it going to affect people? How is it going to change the mood and turn them against accepting more refugees? But I think it's important for us, liberals, left, to think more about how we can reconcile these issues and think much more about security of people, think much more strongly about integration, which we haven't done, and also think about law and order, because people in Germany and Stockholm will naturally want to say, well, we don't want to be under threat just because people are coming here as refugees. And I think it's important for us to say, actually, what's wrong with them wanting some security, and then saying that migrants should think about going to classes to understand the cultural differences. We should have harsher penalties for people who commit rape or murder or even sexual attacks, and also find ways in which to integrate them, housing, languages, and all those sorts of issues.
Come on, what to do about it. I mean, Fraser, I'm interested in whether you think this is a European-wide problem for people of liberal disposition who don't want to talk about these dilemmas and these issues, or whether this is a particular Swedish case, or maybe just a Swedish and a German one.
Well, certainly it's not a British problem. I mean, Britain does not have the problems we're seeing in this scale, not just in Sweden, but in Germany and Denmark and the Netherlands.
But Rotherham, I mean, a lot of people would say Rotherham is a kind of similar problem.
Similar, but it's not to do with immigration. There are British-born people we're dealing with in Rotherham. Right now, what we're seeing in Sweden is a country that prides itself on being a humanitarian superpower, wanting to demonstrate its open credentials by saying we're going to take in more immigration than anybody else, per capita twice as much as the next highest country. The problem is Sweden can't integrate these immigrants. So its failure to integrate has been combined with its eagerness to take them in, and problem is piling up upon problem.
Right.
But don't forget, there's two scandals here. What happened for, by the way, 2 years running in the music festival, but also the cover-up, which makes you ordinary Swede think maybe there's a lot more of these immigrants are doing that we're not being told about.
Right. Now, look, I'd like to talk about what we do about it, but can I just see if you all agree that not talking about these things is unhelpful? I mean, does everybody agree that the police should just say, we've got a crime problem in this group or this ethnic? Nazarene, do you buy that?
No, I agree that we should talk about it, but I think we have been talking about it. I'm not entirely... I think Sweden is a particular example, but I think we shouldn't conflate the dynamics in Sweden, sort of the liberal cover-up that you say happened in Sweden, with what's happening in the UK. You cannot move for commentary on immigration
in the UK.
It's
taken months to find out gangs of guys.
Sweden is a separate case, but I think we do speak about it a lot, and I don't think there's this conspiracy of silence that people think there is.
Well, the conspiracy, in one sense, is that they haven't focused on the ethnicity of these people, and that's where people will say, well, why haven't you talked about that? And actually, in some cases, it's not necessary, but I do think in some cases like this, where there is clear differences, and I've spoken to a social worker today who was from Sweden who said, actually, it's mostly Afghan men, and it's always happened every year. I think that's a particular problem, and they should talk about that.
Everybody, you all basically agree that covering
Absolutely.
it up, you're never going to hide it forever, and then
And it makes things worse.
It makes it worse. Right, let's talk about what we should do about it. Fraser, I mean, what you said it's worse in Sweden than here. Well, what do you do? What should people of a progressive disposition think you sort of suggest you do?
Well, I reckon Britain is demonstrating the common sense compromise in immigration. I think our approach is being vindicated by events in Europe. I mean, right now we're saying, yes, we're going to help the refugee crisis, but we're going to help them at source. We're not going to say whoever's got the strength to come all the way to Britain can do it. Right now, David Cameron is actually being a progressive lodestar. He is showing the way to have immigration to make it work. There is public acceptance for immigration in Britain in a way there isn't in the rest of Europe.
Because we've limited it, is your point.
We are the new melting pot of Europe in this country, a source of great pride.
Right.
Sorry, I think there's a distinction to be made between immigration and letting in political refugees and asylum seekers. And that's a different thing. I think Britain's long-term attitude towards immigration and integration has worked. But I think actually in the past few months, Britain has been shameful in its inability to allow political asylum seekers and refugees in. So I think those are two distinctions that need to be made.
That's been much debated. Sunny, you wrote a blog yesterday. You made a couple of interesting suggestions, didn't you? I mean, firstly, lessons for people coming in on how, for example, to treat women. Is that taboo? Is that all right to do you think?
It's taboo amongst some people, but absolutely. I mean, Norway is now pioneering this. Belgium is just taking it up. I think it's important to talk about the fact that there are clear cultural differences, especially in the fact that Western Europe is much more sexually permissive and open and liberal, and that a lot of refugees come from countries which are not. So why not have classes which are a bit like SRE classes?
Do you buy that?
Yeah, I wouldn't. I think that would be maybe a little bit difficult to pull off, but I do agree that there needs to be more attention paid to integration policies. I think it's unrealistic to expect people to come in and then just give you a warm fuzzy feeling that you're allowing, you know, vulnerable people to come in without actually spending any time or resources and paying attention to how these people integrate over time. So I'm not entirely sure about the mechanism, but I think definitely
that kind of thinking that approach. Look, the other one you said, Sunny, was you should choose your migrants. And for example, you don't want to have a completely disproportionate number of single men. You might want to have women and children among that number.
No, absolutely. I mean, a part of the problem in Sweden and in Germany has been that a lot of the men come early so that they can find out if they've got asylum and then they can bring their families over. But there is a problem if you have too many men coming in and then they've got no work to do and they end up congregating in gangs and it gets things worse.
I'm glad you mentioned work because, Fraser, actually that is one thing that I think happens here. It's basically easy enough to get a job, isn't it?
Exactly. Right now, most unemployed people in Sweden are immigrants. They're 3 times more likely to be unemployed if you're an immigrant than if you're not. In Britain, there's no difference. We've got the best ratio in Europe. Sweden has got the worst. Right now, it's the workplace, which is the great melting pot, which is the great place of integration. The lesson is not taking more immigrants or asylum seekers than your country can handle. Britain's got that balance right, and lots of countries in Europe are getting it wrong.
Well, I mean, I don't think the balance is right.
I think the lesson is to equip your country with the tools to allow people in.
Yeah,
rather
you
than
can
throw the
manage
baby out with the
migration. It's
bathwater.
not a problem to manage immigration, but we're
Till
not
that
doing
last
it
bit,
right.
there was actually quite a lot of interesting agreement in that, but it was good. We need to leave it there. Thanks all.